The northern wind dragged the ocean's damp breath through the narrow streets of Portland. The air tasted of salt and rust, and every gust made the old window frames of the small apartment tremble. Lee Harper sat on the edge of her thin mattress, shoulders hunched, counting coins in a glass jar that had once held strawberry jam. Her fingers smelled faintly of detergent and copper. The kettle whistled in the kitchen, a sharp, tired sound that cut through the quiet of the night. From the small bedroom came the shallow, rhythmic cough of her son, Oliver. The dampness always found him first. It crawled into his lungs, waited, and reminded her how fragile the distance was between calm and panic. She reached for her phone, its cracked screen reflecting a piece of her face blurred by exhaustion. The message she was typing was routine, almost mechanical, a polite request for a payment extension for Oliver's daycare, attached with a PDF invoice from one of her freelance jobs. She ticked the box marked urgent without thinking, scrolled through her contact history, and pressed send. The address field autofilled from memory. She didn't double-check it. The screen went dark for a second, as if holding its breath, then confirmed delivery. Lee exhaled, rubbed her temples, and listened to the whistle fade in the kitchen. Outside, the sea moved restlessly against the docks. The reflection of the street lamp shivered across the window pane, mixing with her own shadow. The phone buzzed once. The message was short and unfamiliar. "Who are you, and why are you sending container numbers?" The words landed like a cold slap. Lee frowned, reopened her email, and froze. The PDF she had sent wasn't the invoice she remembered attaching. Instead, pages of scanned shipping manifests filled the screen, container IDs, docking dates, routes between Boston and Halifax. Files that shouldn't have been on her phone at all. Files that belonged to Nathan Blake. Her throat tightened. Nathan, her ex, the man who had convinced her a year earlier to help him with some paperwork, harmless data entry in a shipping app he never let her fully see. It had seemed trivial then, she needed the money, and he promised it was just logistics. Now the files stared back at her like evidence of a crime she hadn't meant to commit. She started to type an apology, something to explain it was a mistake, but another message arrived before she could finish. Then another. They came fast, one after the other, faster than she could think. Her full name, her address above the fishing supply store, the name of her son, the hospital route she took whenever Oliver had an asthma attack. Her pulse fractured into small, sharp beats. She stood, her knees weak, and looked toward the window. Headlights slid silently across the wet street below. 3 black SUVs pulled up in a line, no sirens, no engines idling, only the shifting beams of their lights cutting through the mist. The storefront sign downstairs flickered and went out, leaving the alley half submerged in shadow. Lee felt the walls around her thin, becoming transparent, fragile, like the glass of a fishbowl. The whole building seemed to breathe differently now, slower, deliberate. She turned off the lights, pressed her back against the cool wall, and clutched her phone. The next message arrived, no threats, no accusations, no demands, just instructions. Go downstairs. Bring the inhaler. Don't wake anyone. The calmness of the words frightened her more than shouting ever could. She looked toward the small bedroom where Oliver's silhouette rose and fell with each breath. His inhaler lay beside his pillow, wrapped in a worn blue cloth. Lee stepped carefully across the creaking floorboards, each sound amplified by the silence. The smell of seaweed and old paint filled her lungs. She packed the inhaler and a small bottle of water into her pocket, her movements automatic, precise, as if she had rehearsed this moment without knowing it. Near the door, her son's backpack leaned against the wall, bright yellow with a patch of a smiling whale, a piece of normal life that suddenly looked foreign. She hesitated, then took it too. When she opened the door, the hallway felt colder than it should have been. The stairwell light flickered once and went out. The city's noise had disappeared. Even the wind seemed to hold back its breath. She walked down, step by careful step, the soles of her shoes whispering against the wood. The smell of wet asphalt and salt water rose to meet her. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the street in silver-gray veils. The SUVs waited with their headlights dimmed, engines silent. She couldn't see who was inside. The air was heavy but not hostile. Somewhere deep inside her, a strange instinct whispered that this wasn't random. Someone had been waiting, not for her mistake, but for her. Lee gripped the inhaler tighter, her skin damp from the cold, and stepped off the final stair. The night folded around her like fog closing over the sea, and for the first time, she didn't know if she was walking toward danger or deliverance. The harbor smelled of salt rope, diesel, and the ghosts of last season's catch. The water slapped lazily against the pilings, each sound hollow, rhythmically indifferent. Lee Harper stood near the edge of the dock, her breath mingling with the mist. Behind her, the city lights flickered through the fog like a half-forgotten constellation. The man beside her seemed untouched by the cold. His gray coat hung perfectly, unmoving despite the wind that tugged at her hair and jacket. His gloves were dark, clean, the kind that never touched anything by accident. His name was Caden Morrow. People in Portland spoke it the way sailors spoke of storms, quietly, as if the sound itself might summon something. He didn't explain who he worked for, and he didn't need to. The silence between them carried more weight than any introduction. He had found her, not through luck, but through inevitability. His presence felt like an answer to a question she hadn't asked yet. He didn't accuse her of sending the wrong file. He didn't list her mistakes or threats. Instead, he spoke of protection, of moving her and her son somewhere safe. The place he mentioned had the vague finality of a sentence already served. A stone house on a hill near the old lighthouse, where glass swallowed the wind and men with earpieces stood like quiet punctuation, marks between the world and its secrets. Lee wanted to refuse. She wanted to gather her son and vanish down some back road until the sea was only a memory. But when she heard Oliver's cough echo through the cracked window above them, something inside her steadied. She nodded once, barely audible even to herself. The night shifted as they drove. Portland's lights blurred into a smear of gold and blue behind rain-slick glass. The convoy moved like a single organism, 3 vehicles, no headlights until they left the main road, engines low and synchronized. The further they climbed, the quieter the world became. The city dropped away, replaced by the rhythmic hum of tires on wet asphalt and the occasional pulse of security lights marking the private estates that overlooked the bay. The house appeared without warning. Granite walls rose out of the mist, the windows glowing faintly as though lit from beneath the surface. It was the kind of structure that didn't ask for attention because it had already been given all of it. When the car stopped, Lee stepped out into air that smelled faintly of cedar and electricity. She felt the gravel give under her boots and heard, somewhere deep within the walls, the low mechanical thrum of generators. Inside, the warmth was immediate and overwhelming. Thick carpets muffled the sound of her steps. Lamps in brass sconces spread a steady amber light that erased shadows before they could gather. It felt deliberate, designed to leave no corner untouched, no space for fear to hide. Oliver stirred in her arms, murmuring through his fever, and Caden gestured toward a corridor that opened into a wide living area. A woman waited there, her hair tied back, her clothes crisp and colorless. She introduced herself as Me, though Lee sensed the name was only a convenience. Me took the boy with surprising gentleness, guiding Lee to a couch near the fire. Within minutes, a doctor arrived, an older man with steady hands and a face carved by years of discretion. He examined Oliver with quiet efficiency, the stethoscope's metal glinting in the firelight. The boy's breathing steadied as a fine mist from a new inhaler filled the room with a sterile scent of menthol and ozone. The doctor wrote something on a small notepad, left the inhaler on the table, and disappeared as silently as he had come. Me returned with a folded set of soft clothes and a grocery bag filled with fresh produce, soup in sealed containers, and a child's toothbrush still in its packaging. Everything Lee hadn't had the time, or the money, to think about was already waiting for her. Caden watched from near the doorway, hands clasped loosely behind his back. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the calm weight of someone who had already calculated every variable. He told her that the numbers in the document she'd sent weren't random. They were tied to shipments under a charitable trust, a front through which someone had funneled large sums of money offshore. The manifests had surfaced in multiple investigations, and her digital signature appeared on several of them. He said it without accusation, more like an observation extracted from a file. He already knew how they had ended up on her phone. Nathan Blake had used her credentials. Lee didn't deny it. She simply asked what would happen now. What would happen to her, to Oliver, if she refused whatever offer was silently being made? The answer came quietly. Outcomes had been calculated, he said, but no one wanted the boy to ever learn the meaning of the word hostage. That night she didn't sleep. She lay beside her son in the wide guest bed, the sheets too clean, the air too still. The hum of unseen machinery filled the silence, the rhythm of servers, heaters, maybe cameras. Somewhere beyond the walls, security patrols moved in measured paths. Every creak, every whisper of wind against glass sounded intentional. She traced the condensation on the window pane with her fingertip, watching it form perfect circles. For a moment, she couldn't tell if they were made by her breath or by something on the other side of the glass watching back. As dawn began to push against the horizon, the fog below the hills swallowed the city completely. From this height, the world looked distant, fragile, as though it existed only because the house allowed it to. Lee turned her head toward Oliver, sleeping now with steady, even breaths. The vapor on the glass began to fade, leaving faint rings, marks that looked like the reticles of a scope or the outline of an eye. She couldn't decide whether they were warning signs or symbols of protection. The glass didn't just reflect her face, it was looking back. The day began with the smell of pancakes and clean linen. Morning light filtered through the wide windows, pale and weightless, touching every polished surface of the house with a kind of deliberate softness. Oliver's laughter echoed faintly through the halls as he darted across the living room floor, leaving damp footprints on the wood. Mee had wiped his face and hands too generously with a wet cloth, and now the boy seemed to shimmer in the light like something briefly returned from sleep. The house revealed its rhythms with the precision of an old clock. Guards moved soundlessly along invisible routes, their reflections sliding through the glass walls like fish beneath still water. None of them looked directly at the child, yet every motion, every shift in posture kept them within reach of a door, a line of sight, an exit. They were polite, deferential even, but their nearness carried the quiet gravity of purpose. Nothing inside these walls was ever left to chance. Lee sat by the panoramic window overlooking the hill and the bay below. The sky and the sea had merged into a single field of diluted gray, erasing the horizon. Somewhere under that pale blanket, ships waited at anchor, invisible but not gone. The world beyond the glass looked emptied of sound, yet she could sense its pulse. She placed her laptop on her knees and began typing. Her message was stripped of emotion. It was neither plea nor accusation, just a clean, deliberate construction of facts. She wrote that she knew about the last transfers through his account, that she had seen the correlation between container numbers and midnight docking schedules, and that someone was no longer searching for cargo, but for the leak itself. She added a location, an address of a small cafe on East End, one that sat near the park where parents picked up their children in the afternoon. The timing was not random. Crowds created anonymity, and anonymity was safety. She did not intend to be bait. She simply wanted witnesses, noise, life around her. When she sent the message, she didn't reread it. The cursor blinked once, then stilled as if holding its breath. Somewhere deeper in the house, she could hear the faint murmur of Caden's team at work. In the study, they had spread a digital map of the city across the main table, streets, traffic patterns, camera placements, signal overlaps. Their voices were low, their rhythm methodical. They reviewed municipal surveillance feeds, cross-checked vantage points, and plotted exit routes that would appear random, but weren't. Every movement of the upcoming encounter was drawn and measured in advance. Lee stood at the doorway once, unnoticed, watching them. The lines of code and street grids reflected in Caden's calm expression looked less like preparation and more like inevitability. She felt as though she were observing an operation performed on something living, her life perhaps, dissected for its vulnerabilities. She understood her role the way a parent understands the pulse of a child on a hospital monitor, helpless to change the outcome, but desperate to comprehend where exactly the heart was in the diagram. Caden emerged from the study a few hours later, his composure unchanged. He told her, in that same even tone, that even if she didn't show up at the meeting, the city would know before Nathan did. In a place like Portland, whispers traveled faster than news, especially near the waterfront, where fishermen traded rumors with the tide. She listened, said nothing, and looked at Oliver asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled up to his chin. Her decision settled quietly, like dust after a collapse. She would not go, not because she trusted Caden completely, but because she had finally understood the scale of what she was standing inside. Whatever Nathan had done, whatever he was running from, it had already moved beyond her reach. The thought of trying to face it alone now felt like stepping into oil that only spread the more you touched it. She had been part of the mechanism without knowing. The least she could do now was stay still enough not to break it further. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of thawing soil. Spring crept through the grounds even as the calendar still insisted it was winter. In the garden, branches trembled under the subtle weight of a security drone gliding above them, its shadow crossing the grass like the movement of a cloud. The air hummed with invisible circuitry, sensors, cameras, quiet networks linking every breath of the estate to a central heartbeat. The house was alive, in its own way. As afternoon deepened, the light over the bay changed from silver to pewter. Lee stood by the glass again, watching the reflection of the house blend into the mist outside. The world seemed paused between one decision and another. She could feel the building breathe, a slow, careful rhythm, converting air into calm, movement into order. It was a living organism made of wires, marble, and control. And for the first time since the night she had sent that wrong message, Lee felt the strange relief of being contained. Evening fell fast, like a tarp dropped over a cargo hold. The city shifted tones, trading daylight for the dull metallic gleam of sodium lamps and harbor lights. The East End Cafe glowed softly in the mist, its windows breathing out small bursts of amber light each time the door opened. The smell of salt, wet rope, and espresso mingled in the narrow alley behind it. Inside, the air hummed with murmurs, the clink of glass, and the kind of silence that lived between people who didn't want to remember each other's faces. Nathan arrived late but precise, wearing tension like a tailored suit. His eyes moved too quickly, scanning the corners rather than the entrance, counting exits before counting breaths. He carried a cheap phone and wore disposable gloves, the kind sold in boxes at gas stations. It was a gesture meant to look professional, but it only exposed his desperation. Nathan was the kind of man who thought safety lived in the visible details. The smarter ones, Caden once said, hid in the pauses between them. Two men followed him at a distance, pretending to share his rhythm. They were not his bodyguards, not exactly, just presence, a pair of silhouettes meant to remind him that protection and surveillance could look the same. Their coats were too new, their shoes too clean for men who worked near the sea. The city's damp air didn't belong to them. Caden's team had arrived hours earlier. They moved without insignia, just neutral layers of gray and black, blending into the dusk like punctuation marks that didn't belong to any sentence. They had already cut the back alley off from the street, redirecting pedestrian traffic through a maintenance detour. Surveillance from the cafe's security, cameras had been rerouted through municipal feeds. A single black SUV idled 2 blocks away, silent and unseen except for the faint trace of condensation curling from its exhaust. When Nathan entered, he hesitated by the counter, glancing at his reflection in the coffee machine's chrome surface. It distorted him, longer, thinner, less human. He ordered nothing. His hands twitched once, then steadied as he moved toward the back door leading to the stairwell. He followed the path he had planned. The narrow service corridor, a metal door, a left turn into the alley, and from there to the car he believed was waiting. It folded in on him quietly. There were no shouts, no sudden sounds of struggle, only the gentle compression of space. The exit door swung inward instead of outward. The men behind him froze as a van door slid open with mechanical precision, its interior light flashing for less than a second. The rest was absorbed by the noise of the harbor, horns, wind, the steady churning of water against the piers. By the time a waitress noticed the back door hanging ajar, the moment had already dissolved. The street resumed its shape, untouched. At the same time, miles away on the hill, Lee sat in the dim light of the nursery, her son's breath soft and rhythmic against her shoulder. She read from a picture book, mouthing the words more than speaking them, her lips tracing the shapes of cartoon animals that danced across the pages. Outside, the wind carried the distant pulse of the ocean. The sound of waves reached the house in slow, uneven intervals, like the fatting heartbeat of the city below. The staff had dimmed most of the lights for the evening, leaving small islands of warmth in the vast rooms. In the darkened glass, the reflection of the nursery merged with the movement of the sea beyond, as if 2 worlds were laid on top of each other. Lee looked through the window and saw the harbor lights blinking, intersecting with the silhouettes of masts swaying in the current. From that distance, it looked like someone was slowly turning the pages of a heavy book, one filled with secrets written in tides. In the control room beneath the house, Caden's analysts watched the feed from the waterfront in silence. No alarms, no violence, only timestamps, digital markers of an operation completed as designed. The retrieval was clean. A black case and an access keycard recovered from the alley, both linked to an encrypted archive. Inside that archive were documents tying the Havenbrook Trust to maritime transport companies that operated beyond U.S. customs law, shell entities trading in routes, not goods. Names of beneficiaries, offshore accounts, and a network of contracts written in languages that refused translation. The official report was clinical. It noted duration, entry points, angles of visibility, packet transfers, and encryption protocols. No mention of confrontation. No mention of the way one of the men had reached for his pocket too slowly, or the brief red flicker of motion caught at the edge of a lens. In this world, violence was measured by data, and silence counted as success. When Caden returned to the house, the night had turned sharp. The salt wind clung to his coat, and the faint hum of generators followed him up the stone steps. He moved through the quiet corridors without sound, his reflection momentarily catching in the blackened windows. Lee met him in the hallway without meaning to, drawn by some half-formed instinct. He looked composed, as he always did. Only when he removed his gloves did she notice the small dark edge staining the cuff of his sleeve. Subtle, almost invisible, like a bruise on fabric. She said nothing. The air between them carried the weight of an unfinished truth. Somewhere below, the servers processed the recovered data, lines of code translating the night into order. Outside, the mist thickened over the water, blurring the harbor lights into one long, trembling band of gold. The invisible bargain was complete. And yet, as Lee watched the faint stain on Caden's coat, she understood something essential. Even the quietest negotiations left residue. Morning came with the soft clink of porcelain and the measured creak of the staircase. The sound didn't belong to the house itself, but to the man ascending it, a lawyer with hair the color of early frost and silver cufflinks that caught the thin sunlight bleeding through the blinds. His presence was deliberate, unobtrusive, as though the air had made room for him in advance. He carried a black leather folder that seemed heavier than its size suggested. When he reached the study, Mee was already there, arranging cups and pouring coffee with a precision that made even silence feel choreographed. Caden stood by the window, watching the fog peel away from the bay below. He didn't speak when the lawyer placed the folder on the desk. Lee entered a moment later, her hands still faintly damp from washing the breakfast dishes. The air inside the room carried the scent of cedar and old paper. The folder opened with a dry whisper. Inside lay neat stacks of documents bound in cream-colored covers, name change applications, insurance records, freshly issued birth certificates, digital identity resets, and travel approvals. There were printed email addresses, pre-configured accounts with encrypted credentials, and a provisional health plan for Oliver registered in another state. Every line, every signature space, every official seal seemed to hum with quiet efficiency. Lee stared at the papers, her mind blank at first, then slowly filling with fragments of old images. The glass jar of coins, the nights she had counted them by lamplight, the small victories that had felt monumental. She thought of how easily value moved now, from glass to paper, from desperation to formality, when the right machinery turned behind you. The system had taken her chaos and ironed it flat, pressing it into a geometry she could neither resist nor fully trust. The lawyer explained the logistics in a neutral tone. By the end of the week, their new identities would be verified in 2 separate databases. The records linking them to Portland would dissolve under procedural revisions, legal, quiet, irreversible. Their digital footprints would redirect to a dormant branch of a medical network based in Providence. New addresses would appear, new driver's licenses, new utility accounts. Nothing extraordinary, nothing to attract attention. Just the quiet disappearance of one life into the folds of another. Lee nodded but said nothing. Her fingers brushed the edge of the documents, tracing the embossed letters like braille. Her eyes caught the reflection of Caden's watch ticking steadily in the polished surface of the table. Time, too, seemed to have its paperwork. He told her, evenly, that Havenbrook would cease to exist by the following month. Its shell entities would close offshore. Its trustees would reappear as consultants for a foundation that existed only in registration forms. The law would handle the rest. Whatever noise might arise from the wreckage would die before reaching the shore, drowned by 2 breakwaters, paper and reputation. One belonged to the documents he had just handed her, the other to the men and women whose signatures were trusted by judges. Nathan, he added, was alive. His voice didn't linger on the name. The man was cooperating, performing the slow rituals of those who finally understood what it meant to have a limit and to stand at its edge. Lee didn't ask for details. She knew there were kinds of survival that didn't require explanation. When the lawyer left, the study emptied back into its habitual quiet. The papers remained on the desk like fossils of decisions already made. Lee sat in the leather chair opposite the wall map, an old maritime chart dotted with ports and shipping routes. She traced the coastline with her fingertip, starting at Portland, sliding south through Providence, then down toward the warmer waters of Virginia. The paper was cool under her touch. The thought of gentler winters, of mornings without the whistle of leaking windows, without the sharp cough that tore through the house at 4 a.m., spread through her like a fragile warmth she didn't want to disturb. For a long while she stayed there, listening to the faint mechanical hum that filled every corner of the house. It wasn't noise. It was function, order, the sound of things that worked because they had to. She knew the house was not a refuge in the romantic sense. It was an agreement, a structure built on promises and vigilance. Every lock, every protocol, every unseen hand was part of the same language, protection with conditions. When Caden returned, she told him she would accept the new documents, but under terms of her own. She wanted access, read-only, she specified, to the security feeds near Oliver's future school, to the contact list of his pediatrician, to evacuation routes in case of storms or blackouts. Her voice was steady, pragmatic. It was not a request born of mistrust, but of survival. She had lived too long in the kind of quiet that erased people. She needed this new silence to be one, where she could still hear her own steps. Caden listened, then inclined his head once. The gesture carried neither agreement nor refusal, only acknowledgement. The kind that meant her conditions were already being processed somewhere behind a layer of glass and circuitry. Later that afternoon, Lee stood again by the window overlooking the garden. The fog had thinned, revealing the curve of the bay below and the distant cranes of the port. The world outside moved on, unaware of the small exchanges that decided its balance. She thought of the phrase that had begun to circle her mind since dawn, the price of silence. It wasn't measured in money, nor in the risk she had taken, but in the steady acceptance that peace had its currency, and it was always collected in pieces of identity. Oliver's laughter carried faintly from the hallway as Mee helped him with his shoes. The sound drew a small, reluctant smile from Lee. She picked up the folder, pressed it to her chest for a moment, and breathed in the faint scent of ink and paper. The machinery of her new life had already begun to turn, quiet and precise. Outside, the glass of the windows mirrored the room back at her. For the first time in months, she didn't flinch at her own reflection. The house, the silence, the structure, they were still cages, perhaps, but ones she had chosen. And in that choice lay the first trace of freedom she could recognize. By the end of the week, the house had grown familiar, reshaping itself around their presence the way the sea reshapes sand without ever asking permission. Oliver no longer startled at the clipped bursts of radio chatter that drifted through the halls in the evenings. He learned to ignore the metallic rhythm of the security gates opening and closing at dusk. Mee had memorized his preferences with quiet precision, how he liked his oatmeal thick and his milk lukewarm, how he always wanted the blue cup with the chipped handle. The routines, once foreign, began to resemble a language they all shared without speaking. Lee found her own ritual too. In the afternoons, she sat near the tall window at the corner of the living room, where the signal from the outside world was strongest. The glass caught faint traces of a network connection, waves of invisible data that rose and fell with the weather, like tides in air instead of water. She didn't make calls. She only watched the small bars appear and vanish, timing them against the rhythm of her own breathing. It was her measure of control, her proof that the world still existed beyond the perimeter. On the table behind her lay the sealed envelopes. Inside them were their new names, letters printed neatly on government paper, heavy with ink and embossed stamps. There was nothing magical in them, only the quiet geometry of bureaucracy and the deliberate weight of permanence. Their lives had been folded, reassigned, archived, and delivered back to them with signatures. It was not rebirth, only administration. But even that, Lee thought, was a kind of grace. 3 departure routes had been drafted and approved. One was false, a decoy constructed for whoever might still be watching the house from beyond the property fence. The other 2 were functional, drawn in discrete arcs across the map, one leading to a train station in Connecticut, the other to a small private airport hidden between pine fields north of the state border. Their schedules were staggered, their manifests mismatched, each a line written in sand. The logistics were airtight, efficient, and impersonal. All they required now were her initials in the margin. But Lee had made her decision. She would stay, not as a guest under protection, not as a dependent of Caden's network, and certainly not as a symbol of success in some invisible ledger. Her conditions were simple, inflexible, shaped by weeks of thought and the calm obstinacy that came from surviving uncertainty too long. Financial independence first, her own account, her own labor, unconnected to any trust or hidden pipeline. Then Oliver's education, structured not for convenience but for resilience. Sports without dust, controlled breathing, air that did not provoke the tight rasp in his chest. Finally, she set boundaries for communication. Who could reach her, how often, and under what pretext. Nothing would be rewritten without her consent. The house accepted these terms without resistance. Adjustments followed quietly. Permissions granted, filters applied, access codes recalibrated. It was as if the place had absorbed her decisions into its architecture. Like water around breakwaters, the system flowed around her demands, never clashing, only adjusting. The balance felt precarious but functional. The way low tide always reveals just enough sand to suggest the shore still holds. Nathan no longer existed within her visible world. His presence had thinned, receding into that gray distance where consequence and memory overlap. Rumors filtered through the quiet channels Caden controlled, fragments of compliance reports, travel logs, faint echoes of someone learning to survive underwater in a world that no longer carried his name. Lee didn't dwell on it. He was still alive somewhere, but the shape of his existence had ceased to matter. The remnants of her old life had condensed into a few tangible objects now locked in the house's safe. Her previous phone rested there, its battery long dead, beside a small flash drive filled with photographs from Oliver's daycare and his first drawing of a sun rising over an uneven ocean. They were relics, fragments of a version of her that no longer aligned with the woman watching the coastline through bulletproof glass. Outside, the water moved with slow persistence. The bay shimmered under the cold light of morning, each wave folding into another like a secret passed hand to hand. Lee pressed her palm to the window, feeling the cool surface hum faintly beneath her skin. Her reflection looked back, calmer, sharper, no longer blurred by exhaustion. The faint circles under her eyes remained, but they no longer carried defeat. The house no longer seemed like an island set apart from the world. It had become a boundary, an exact point where two forces met and neither could fully claim victory. It was the place where tide met sand, where stillness met motion, and where every decision, however small, was a negotiation between freedom and safety. She understood that this was not peace in the naive sense. It was endurance, active and deliberate, the kind of peace earned by vigilance. She closed the safe and returned to the kitchen. On the refrigerator door hung a new list, written in her neat, deliberate handwriting: appointments, grocery items, medical reminders. At the top, underlined twice, was their new surname, unfamiliar but steady. Beneath it, a note in smaller letters: check inhaler, 8 a.m. daily. Outside, the lighthouse turned. Its beams swept the coastline, slicing the mist into fragments of light. The reflection caught on the windows of the house, a moving stripe of brightness that paused for a breath before fading. For a brief moment, it looked like a signature written across the glass, a mark of presence, of continuity, of a story that no longer needed to hide. The light passed on, but its echo stayed, a quiet proof that the tide had reached its line, and that Lee Harper, whatever name she now carried, had learned how to stand at its edge without stepping back. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.